Welcome back, Science 10. This is the second part of the 1.2 video, the first section of CD2. Climate change. If one day in April happens to have a temperature of 29 degrees C, does this mean that climate is changing? No, the temperature in one day is just a part of that day's weather. Because remember, climate is a period of 30 years. Climate change is a change that occurs in the climate over time, usually a minimum of 30 years. Scientists determine if the climate in an area has changed by comparing the average weather over the last 30 or more years with the average weather conditions over a similar time period in the past. If every day in April had been warmer for the last 30 years, then the average temperature in Aprils over the last 100 years, that would be a strong evidence that climate is changing. So if it's warmer in the last 30 years than the previous 30 years, then yes, we could conclude that climate is in fact changing. So you can see it's not over year to year, it's a long period of time because we need a good average to see if it's really changing. Earth has experienced climate change a number of times in its history, according to evidence such as that from the ice core samples that I mentioned earlier at the start of the last video. During some periods, the climate became cooler and warmer during others. Today, the average surface temperature of Earth is definitely increasing, according to two kinds of evidence: anecdotal evidence and scientific evidence. So what's the difference between these two? Let's take a look. Anecdotal of climate change relies on reports from people about particular weather events and how they interpret these events changing over time. Anecdotal evidence is often useful but has not been carefully tested, so it's not necessarily scientific, to ensure it is unbiased and that it applies to situations other than the particular events reported. So unbiased means it hasn't been influenced by someone, but in case the person reporting it may have a certain bias or sided view of it. For example, farmers in Alberta report that the growing season begins earlier now than it did years ago, but there's no documentation of that, not written down. Aboriginal and Inuit leaders and leaders in Canada's north have also reported changes in weather events over time, including the first frost date, the start of animal migration, and thickness of ice, but again, no data written down to support that. These observations all suggest that the average temperature is increasing. Scientific evidence of climate change relies on evidence collected in a manner that, as much as possible, ensures it is unbiased, so there's not one particular side influencing the results, and that reflects general situations instead of just particular events. Scientific evidence is usually collected by trained scientists and is checked by other scientists. It often collects data using specialized instruments and analyzing that data. So much of our evidence about historical climate conditions relies solely on anecdotal, word of mouth, so to speak, because we just didn't have the instrumentation to collect the data and analyze it until we started looking at ice core samples. Anecdotal evidence and scientific evidence may provide information about the same or similar events. For example, scientists at Environment Canada have graphed the average yearly temperature in Canada from 1948 to 1999. And this is the graph that results. The graph provides scientific evidence that agrees with the anecdotal evidence that the average yearly temperature in Canada tends to be higher now than it was in the past. The data for this graph were collected from weather stations across Canada. The collected data were then used to calculate an average value for the whole of Canada, which was then plotted on the graph. So we're looking at all of Canada here. Average yearly temperature of all of Canada. And from 1945 to 2000, as zero is, it says here, the graph indicates scientific evidence, etc. The 0 point indicates no temperature change occurred. So no temperature change, and then you can see it has fluctuated. And over here, we're kind of at around this peak area. Of course, there's fluctuations there, but you can see it's an increase of 1.5 degrees C. So the temperature change is up by 1.5 degrees C from 1945. And of course there are the fluctuations to consider as well. Interpreting the climate data, the graph that we just looked at also demonstrates how difficult it is to detect changes in climate. According to scientists from Environment Canada, the data in the graph indicate that the average temperature in Canada increased by 1 degree C from 1948 to 1999 approximately. This was determined from the line of best fit for the data points in the graph. This was not a straightforward task, since the average temperature change for some years was much warmer than previous years and sometimes colder. Also, not all regions in Canada experience the same variations in Canada. So averaging all of Canada you can see it's very difficult to conclude what's going on. Yes, we can conclude that it's up a bit, but again, all of Canada here. It would have been better maybe to analyze each individual province separately and see how that worked. We do not have a complete record of Earth's past climate, and we do not yet fully understand all of the factors that affect climate today. What is known, though, is that the climate is very important to the biosphere, and climate change could have consequences to all life on Earth. So yes, so we have the increase in temperature, but it also affects animals particularly suited to their environment. If that environment changes, the animal would have to adapt in a very quick fashion. Same with plants, and of course, lastly here, which we view as important too, how does it affect our daily life? How would it affect what we need for clothes, where we live, etc., our exposure to sun? All those things are considered. Okay, so right at this point, there should be an assignment here that's included. It's fairly easy and straightforward. I think I kind of highlighted most of the answers that you need. So number 1, how is climate different from weather? Number 2, describe one example of how climate affects people. So we talked about many different things here. Describe how climate affects animals. We talked about that in depth. Number 4, what is meant by climate change? 5, so why is it that scientists look at data for the past 30 years as evidence for climate change? So I did talk about that a little bit as well. You may have to look back in the video. And lastly, distinguish between anecdotal evidence and scientific evidence, and give one example of anecdotal evidence of climate change and one example of scientific evidence of climate change. Again, you should be able to easily find that. All right, we'll see you again.